Subscribe for more true infidelity stories. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and check out our channel for more captivating tales like this one. I hadn't expected to see Mike that evening. He and my husband Dan had been close for years, college buddies who managed to stay in touch, despite life pulling them in different directions. Mike was the kind of friend who popped by now and then, usually for dinner or to watch a game with Dan. He was easy to like. Charming, funny, the kind of guy who could slip effortlessly into any conversation. But I'd never thought of him as anything more than Dan's old friend. Until that night. It was a quiet Friday evening, and Dan had called earlier to say he'd be working late. I had plans for myself, a cozy night on the couch with a movie or maybe cracking open that book I'd started months ago. But those plans shifted the moment the doorbell rang. I opened the door to find Mike standing there, grinning like he always did. A six-pack dangled from one hand, his trademark casual confidence evident in the way he leaned against the doorframe. "Dan's not home yet," I said, stepping aside to let him in. "Yeah, I know," he replied with a shrug. "He told me to come by anyway. Thought I'd keep you company until he gets here." I didn't mind. Mike had always been good company. Besides, this wasn't the first time we'd hung out without Dan around. I offered him a drink, and soon we found ourselves in the kitchen, chatting as I prepared dinner. At first, it was all light and casual, small talk about his day and updates on his latest work projects. But somewhere along the way, the dynamic began to shift. It was subtle at first, like a faint change in the air. I couldn't pinpoint the exact moment it happened, but by the time I realized it, the atmosphere between us was no longer the same. I caught myself laughing a little too hard at one of his jokes, the kind of laugh that felt more like a reflex than genuine amusement. When our eyes met, something flickered in my chest, a flutter I hadn't felt in years. I tried to dismiss it. We were just friends, and I was overthinking it. But the way Mike looked at me, it wasn't how a man looks at his best friend's wife. Or maybe it was, and I'd never noticed it before. Either way, it unsettled me. As we stood in the kitchen, the tension grew. He leaned casually against the counter, but his gaze lingered on me just a little too long. "You know," he said, his tone softer now, "I don't think I've ever told you how much I appreciate you, Karen. You're always so kind, so easy to talk to." The words caught me off guard, and I felt heat rush to my cheeks. I busied myself at the stove, avoiding his eyes. "Well, I try," I managed, though my voice came out more flustered than I'd intended. "Dan's lucky to have you as a friend." There was a pause, a long, charged silence that made me hyper-aware of his presence. He was close. Too close. The space between us seemed to shrink with every second. My heart pounded, and I hated the way it betrayed me. This was Mike, for God's sake, practically family. But the look in his eyes told me he wasn't thinking of me as family, not tonight. "Karen," he murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. The way he said my name sent a shiver down my spine. It had been so long since anyone had looked at me like that, let alone said my name with that kind of intensity. It stirred something deep within me, something I thought had been buried under the weight of years and routine. I turned to face him, and for a moment, time seemed to freeze. The air between us was thick, charged with something unspoken yet impossible to ignore. His eyes locked onto mine, searching for something I wasn't sure I was ready to give. Deep down, I knew we were teetering on the edge of a line neither of us had any business crossing. Before either of us could speak, the sound of the front door opening shattered the silence. Dan was home. The click of the door and the thud of his footsteps down the hallway were like a splash of cold water. I blinked, snapping myself out of whatever spell I'd been under, and turned quickly back to the stove. My hands moved mechanically, stirring the food as though pretending nothing had just happened could make it true. "Hey, babe!" Dan's voice rang out, full of his usual warmth as he strolled into the kitchen. "Mike, you're here early." I forced a smile, hoping it masked the storm churning inside me. "Dinner's almost ready," I said, keeping my tone light and casual. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Mike straighten up from the counter, his easy grin already back in place. He greeted Dan like nothing was amiss, slipping seamlessly into their familiar camaraderie. But when our eyes met briefly across the room, a flicker of something raw and undeniable passed between us, a quiet acknowledgement of the moment we'd just shared. Dan and Mike dove into their usual banter, their voices filling the room with laughter and easy conversation about work, sports, and old college memories. I played my part, dishing out dinner and chiming in with the occasional laugh, but my heart wasn't in it. Every so often, I felt Mike's gaze on me, subtle yet unmistakable, and it sent a ripple of unease and something far more dangerous through me. I hated how acutely aware of him I'd become, how much his presence now felt different. Worse still, I hated how a part of me liked it. As we sat down to eat, I tried to focus on Dan. He was in his element, his charm and enthusiasm lighting up the room. I loved him. I did. But the way Mike had said my name earlier, the quiet intensity in his voice, lingered in my mind. That moment between us hadn't been casual. It had felt like a door cracking open to something I hadn't dared to imagine. After dinner, Dan suggested we head to the living room to watch a game. I hesitated, my instincts screaming at me to find an excuse to leave, to put some distance between Mike and me. But I didn't want to arouse suspicion or make things awkward, so I agreed, forcing a smile as I followed them to the couch. Dan took his usual spot on one end, I settled in the middle, and Mike sat on the opposite side. At first, everything seemed normal. The game blared on the TV and Dan's attention was glued to the screen. For a brief moment, I convinced myself I'd imagined everything earlier. But then, subtly, almost imperceptibly, Mike shifted closer. It wasn't enough for Dan to notice, but it was enough for me to feel. The heat of his body next to mine, the faint brush of his knee against mine. It was like a jolt of electricity. I stiffened, my breath catching, but Dan didn't seem to notice. He was engrossed in the game, oblivious to the silent storm brewing beside him. I tried to focus on the screen, forcing myself to care about the players and the score, but it was impossible. Every small movement Mike made seemed amplified, the slight lean of his body toward mine, the casual way his arm rested on the back of the couch, the faint scent of his cologne. It was maddening. My pulse quickened with every accidental touch, every fleeting glance. I hated the tension, but I hated even more how much I felt alive in it. The faint brush of his leg against mine, the way his arm rested just a little too close to my shoulder, it was maddening. I could feel my resolve fraying with every passing second, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could pretend that nothing was happening. I glanced at him, trying to read his intentions, hoping I'd find some innocent explanation in his expression. But the look he gave me left no room for doubt. It wasn't friendly, and it certainly wasn't casual. It was laced with quiet hunger, a raw intensity that made my stomach twist and my heart pound in a way I hadn't felt in years. For a fleeting moment, panic seized me. What if Dan noticed? What if he could feel the charged air crackling between Mike and me? But when I turned to look at him, there he was, completely absorbed in the game, his face lit with carefree amusement. He was utterly oblivious to the storm brewing just a few feet away. I should have been relieved. Instead, it made the tension unbearable. I was trapped between the two of them, my husband on one side, his best friend on the other, and all I could think about was how wrong this was, and yet how much I didn't want it to stop. The minutes stretched out endlessly, each one heavier than the last. Mike's subtle movements seemed magnified now, each one deliberate and impossible to ignore. His leg remained pressed against mine, the heat of his skin a constant reminder of his closeness. His glances were fleeting but heavy with meaning, carrying unspoken words that I dared not acknowledge. The surreal nature of it all left me disoriented, like I was watching a scene unfold in someone else's life. I told myself to move, to make an excuse and leave the room, but my body refused to obey. I was frozen, caught in the push and pull of my own desires and guilt. I hated myself for the way my body betrayed me, for the way I couldn't ignore the thrill of being seen, of being wanted. It had been so long since anyone looked at me like that, let alone touched me with that kind of intent. Mike's hand rested on his knee, so close to mine that I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I stared at it, willing myself not to move, to stay perfectly still and let this moment pass. But then his fingers twitched, brushing lightly against my leg. It was barely a touch, the briefest graze of his skin against mine, but it sent a shockwave through me. My breath hitched, my pulse quickened, and a shiver rippled down my spine. I glanced at Dan, desperate to see if he'd noticed, but he was still oblivious. Laughing at something on the screen, I shifted slightly, trying to create some distance between Mike and me without drawing attention to myself. But Mike didn't back off. Instead, his hand moved again, this time just enough for our fingers to touch.
The tension was unbearable. The brush of his leg against mine, the casual placement of his arm too close to my shoulder. My mind raced with a mix of confusion, guilt, and unwilling desire. When his hand moved slightly and his fingers brushed against mine, a jolt of electricity coursed through me. He didn't pull away, and neither did I. A voice screamed in the back of my head to stop, to get up, to end this before it spiraled out of control, but I couldn't move. The weight of guilt crushed me, yet it was eclipsed by the thrill coursing through my veins. I hated him for testing these boundaries, but more than that, I hated myself for allowing it. For what, Karen? Mike's whisper barely rose above the background hum of the television. His voice was soft, laced with a seriousness that made my pulse quicken. When I turned to him, his eyes held mine with an intensity that stripped away every pretense. My heart thundered, the sound deafening in my ears. Words felt dangerous, a trigger to shatter whatever fragile hold I had left. But just as the moment tipped dangerously into uncharted territory, Mike broke the spell. He leaned back, clearing his throat as he sat upright. Relief washed over me, yet it came paired with an inexplicable sense of regret. I exhaled a shaky breath, realizing I had been holding it for far too long. Dan, ever oblivious, turned toward us with a casual smile. "You two okay? You've been quiet." I forced a laugh, feigning nonchalance. "Yeah, I'm fine, just tired, I guess." My voice felt foreign, far removed from the turmoil swirling inside. Mike didn't echo the sentiment. He only glanced at me briefly before redirecting his focus on my face. I followed him from the TV, but he paused to look at me. Swirling inside, the rest of the evening blurred past. I avoided Mike, kept my distance, and seized the first opportunity to excuse myself. Upstairs in bed, I heard the muffled sound of their laughter below. Everything seemed normal to them, but nothing felt normal to me. Dan's steady breathing beside me that night felt like a balm and a burden all at once. I loved him deeply, yet what had transpired with Mike had unsettled something I thought was unshakable. As the night wore on, I promised myself that whatever magnetic pull had surfaced between Mike and me would never go further. Lines had been blurred, but they wouldn't be crossed. Still, a small voice deep within whispered a haunting truth. Some boundaries, once approached, are impossible to retreat from.